Steve and Mary for the lunch. I mean, we paid them well for it, but the quality they provide is marvellous, and they never let us down. The afternoon session is shorter because we put the hard work at the start, not necessarily in terms of intellectual capacity for the afternoon or quality of work, just those shorter sessions. We will have 2 papers and then we'll have a short interlude where you're encouraged to get some coffee, and I hope some coffee is actually there. Then come back and sit down because Tom Van, the Dean of Architecture, is going to talk, but he's only got 30 minutes. He's going to come in at, I believe, 3 o'clock and give us a short talk on the notion of quality, of what is quality research in learning environments work. And then we'll have 2 more papers after that. I'd like to welcome back Claire Newton as our interlocutor for this first of the afternoon sessions. Claire is known by everybody here, but I would like to give her a warm welcome first of all for her introduced session this morning, which she carried off beautifully. But Claire has been difficult to learn. When I first came to learn, Claire was one of those people that really brought in, myself from the graduate school of education into the fold. Claire is currently Director of Bachelor Environments within Architecture. She has got extraordinary research background. Already she has been first Chief Investigator on 2 ARC grants, the Smart Green Schools grant and the Future Proof Schools grant. Claire's got a remarkable capacity to be able to work with people collaboratively, which fits into some of the things that we're running through the day today. And the other thing that's important about Claire is she herself is completing a Doctorate of Education from the University. So comes with that practicing architect background, also with an education focus. So we really welcome you back, Claire, and thank you in advance for your insights into the afternoon sessions. We're still starting 10 minutes late, so I'm going to have to move it. Pippa is up first, and if you want to just get your thing up and running, that'd be good. Pippa's going to talk to us about a competency evaluation tool that is used to measure the quality of the interior of approved classrooms in particular. And it dovetails nicely with some of the things that was said earlier by Leanne, which is talking about working with people with hearing difficulties in the classroom. Pippa has actually got the bee's knees of tools to look at. And she fits into the afternoon theme, which is looking at what is the emerging knowledge now. It's coming out of some of the research that our high degree students bring to learning environments. So, Pippa, I'll turn straight over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wes. Oh, wonderful. So one of the advantages of presenting later on in the day is I get to think about how my research has fit into the much broader framework that has been talked about already. And I guess this is almost a bit of a disclaimer. I'm acknowledging that classrooms are really complex spaces, and I'm not trying to walk in with the solution for everything, but in fact a very small field of inquiry, which is indoor environment quality, but cannot be underestimated. Basically, indoor environment quality, it's with us all the time. Every time we walk into a building, we're confronted with acoustics, light, air quality, thermal comfort issues. But unlike these diagrams which suggest that we might experience them separately, we in fact always experience them together as a combined impact. Inside a classroom, IEQ, I'm just going to call it that for short, is of such importance for thinking about how students have the potential to learn effectively, and for teachers, the ability to effectively teach. And what's interesting from the research I've done is that so many adults walk into a space, into a classroom, and think about the indoor environment quality, but in fact they perceive it differently from the way that children will. Children are in a dynamic state of growth. Their minds and their bodies are developing, and already Leanne has suggested if you can't see it, you can't hear it, you can't say it. So the importance of good indoor environment quality for developing basic comprehension. Having a quick look at some existing research that's been done on indoor environment quality, we've focused substantially on the indoor environment quality in commercial office spaces, because the research identifies that if workplaces have good IEQ, then therefore staff are more productive and therefore businesses turn over more money. So we're very much focused on the IEQ of commercial spaces. Schools have sat on the periphery, And if we take a look at where that research has been mainly undertaken, it's primarily been taken overseas, with Australia just making up one very, very small part of the overall picture. So to help with this, I've developed a new post-occupancy evaluation tool. Now, the term POE has been thrown around already this morning, and I'm just going to emphasise that the tool, it's a process that actually will guide you through. And the outcomes and the findings that are available can assist design professionals in particular to try and understand how their buildings are performing. Now, this term design professionals I'm going to use again and again, and it's because that's me. I'm architecturally trained, yet I don't want to close off the field to say this is only important for architects. It's important for any professional that is involved in designing and producing classrooms, a range of different professionals. And in developing a new POE tool, it's good to know what's already out there, hundreds, but I looked specifically at a range of 40 plus POE tools. I looked at POE tools that are specific to educational facilities, and I looked at POE tools that are specific to IEQ. And the key findings were that the educational facilities generally evaluated the quality of the indoor environment using subjective methods, whilst the commercial environments tended to use a mix of subjective and objective methods. So by objective, I mean environmental monitoring, and by subjective, I mean questionnaires and walkthroughs. Now, I'm approaching this research, I'm a pragmatist and I'm interested in causality, so Terry and I have that in common. And I guess thinking about all of these factors that influence on the quality of the indoor environment, not only internally but climate, season, a whole range of factors. Basically, the limitations of subjective methods is that our sensory system doesn't allow us to be able to differentiate between everything. So if a space has bad acoustics, we will primarily pick up on the fact that the acoustics are bad, and we might not identify that something like air quality, which is odorless and colourless, it could be affecting us in ways that we don't recognise. So it is important to measure IEQ using objective methods such as environmental monitoring equipment. So I developed the EDGI tool using a mixed methods methodology, applying qualitative and quantitative methods, and I collected data objectively using environmental monitoring, descriptive methods, so overt observation, looking at how the building was performing by way of design, construction, maintenance, operation, and then an element of stakeholder engagement, just to find out from the stakeholders what they actually thought was important. One of the other key findings from looking back at these existing POE tools is the fact that people aren't thinking about how they're presenting the information. So all of this research is being collected, but we're not thinking about the audience that we're trying to bring this research back to. So a really important thing for me, being a designer and really valuing good communication, is how can I communicate my findings back to the people that actually want to know about how things are performing. So in a nutshell, the indoor environment quality, the POE tool, I've applied systems thinking. So I've thought of the indoor environment quality being a system. And that system is made up of subsystems, so acoustics, air quality, thermal comfort, and light. And each of those subsystems is made up of components. And the reason that classrooms can't be evaluated using the tools that we've designed for office places is because students are not adults. They're evolving, they're in that dynamic state of growth. So I'll come back to this, but I've identified 16 components which are important for effective teaching and learning. I've then developed an evaluation index which enables me to score the performance of the components out of 10. It's a system that a lot of people can relate to. And finally, I've defined a threshold of minimum performance. So quickly just going through the literature, so much literature, but basically in a nutshell, I've identified what the components are that are important to effective teaching and learning, and I've identified over 40. So what are the things about the indoor environment quality in a classroom that could have an impact on potential effective teaching and learning? And you can see here that we very much have a bias towards air quality, and there's very good reasons for that. Air quality is associated with asthma. Asthma is associated with absenteeism. If you're not at school, you can't learn. The other IEQ factors tend to have more of a impact on impaired performance. So you can be in the classroom but just not learning as well. Because I've already said that I'm interested in causality and I've identified over 40 components, I've grouped them back into the subsystems that they're part of, and I've then looked at the literature to try and understand what the causal relationship is between these different components. And through this process, I've been able to identify 4 components for each subsystem. The evaluation index brings together over 70 standards and codes internationally. So much information. And it's really difficult as a designer to try and understand what all these different codes actually mean. So I've tried to apply this rule where 1 is terrible, 10 it's awesome. And basically, if you do an evaluation of a classroom, and say, for example, you find that the classroom's 38 decibels, well, that doesn't mean a lot to anyone other than Leanne and I, but using an evaluation index, you're able to define that it means good practice. And we all understand what good practice is. Somewhere better than okay practice, but not as good as excellent practice. It starts to bring qualitative meaning to quantitative data. And basically what the tool does is, as well as developing the tool, I've gone through and I've evaluated all the existing methodologies for collecting data about these 16 components. And I've developed a system that you can go in and collect this data, but rather than taking the results in decibels, lux, parts per billion, things that don't make very much sense to anyone other than the engineers in the room, I've applied this scoring system which we can make sense of. So basically how it works is the infographic, which is a data visualization method, is where all of the results are contained. And basically the outer edges of the infographic mean better results, more vibrant colors. The inner means less well. And the dashed line in the center is the threshold of minimum performance. So once you've gone through and you've identified how each component is performing, if it's below that threshold of minimum performance, it's suggesting that there might be a problem. And what that enables you as a design professional or as a consultant to go in and try and understand, based on the descriptive data you've collected, why it's performing the way that it's performing. So I suggest that the Edu tool will provide information to designers across 3 scales. It provides you information across a macro scale. How is it performing as a whole? It then enables you to look at the individual subsystems. How is acoustics performing? How is light performing? And then it allows you to go to a macro scale and look at how the individual components are performing within the system. And this particular tool enables us to now look at the performance of different climate zones. So in closing, the Edu tool, there are 4 different groups of people that will benefit from this tool. So already, by having better environments for learning, then students have a better opportunity to gain more effective teaching and learning, aware of there being pedagogy and a whole range of other issues. Teachers have the opportunity to work in workplaces which are better for them, so improving their well-being and their health. School administrators have a system where they're now able to identify where something may not be performing so well, so that you can actually direct that remedial work in a cost-effective way at addressing the problems that are going to have results. And finally, design professionals have an opportunity to have access to information which will help them make decisions in future about their design process and about how they should be designing classrooms. That's it.
Thanks very much, Philippa. I sort of itched to get that tool into place in the number of places I've been. While we wait for the slides to change over, I'd like to introduce Paramas. Paramas is a PhD student in the Faculty of Architecture. He's a practicing architect. He has a particular interest in historical interpretations and studying historical aspects of architecture. I think it's noteworthy to say that today we've had 3 streams running. This is the first. The first stream, of course, was issues. The second being methodology, and now we're into the foundation of developing knowledge, what's coming from this sort of new research that's happening. Within that, we've had embedded a whole bunch of topics. I'll just quickly run through what they are. We've talked about change, we've talked about collaboration, we've talked about teacher influence on design, we've talked about architects' influence on pedagogy, We've talked about tertiary spaces, empirical measuring of impact. We've had 2 or 3 lovely presentations on sort of the notion of holistic tools. We've talked about disadvantaged students and their role in the classroom and how we should account for them. With Paramus, we're addressing a new topic now, which is the whole notion of culture. And particularly what Paramus wants to speak to us about is the notion of designing tertiary spaces, and with a focus on this notion of relationship between Iranian architecture and the way that westernised culture has come in and is changing that, and what's happening at the moment. Paramus, come and join us. Look forward to this. Thank you very much.
The topic I want to talk about in this lecture is the design of higher education learning spaces in Iran from the Qajar period to the present time. Oh, yeah, for sure. It is a chart showing the Qajar period, which is ranging from about 120 years, and it shows the wars, Iranian wars with foreign countries, that caused the ministers and the rulers to send some Iranian student abroad to studying and gaining knowledge about military knowledge to modernize the society and the government in Iran. And this happened here and here when the Amir Kabir became the Grand Minister. The architecture of Iranian colleges and universities has stylistically changed since the first European-style technical college was established in Iran in the early 1850s. Education in Iran had been based upon traditional apprenticeship by the mid-19th century. On the 21st of August 1851, in the Baghaye Ettefaqi newspaper, it was reported that the government had decided to build a place for teaching modern science on 1 year earlier, in 1815, and that the building had been under construction. On the 8th of December 1851, Baghaye Ettefaqi, the same newspaper, reported that Darul Funun had been built, and the main aim of it was to train youth in engineering, military, medicine, surgery, mining, and science. A stone placed into one of the walls shows the date 1268 Hijri Qamari, the lunar Islamic calendar, that may have been 1851 or 1852. However, the mastermind behind building the first secular college in Persia was Mirza Taqi Khan Farahani, titled as Amir Kabir, Amir Atabak, Amir Nizam. We can mean it as the Grand Minister. Adamiyat, Feridun Adamiyat in Amir Kabir and Iran, published in 1975, describes his significant role in developing and modernizing Persia. Mirza Taqi Farahani had lived in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Tiflis for 10 months and had visited technical schools and military facilities and training centers, as well as a variety of other modern building types such as banks, factories, and theaters. When he was appointed Grand Minister in 1858, he was ready to implement his dream of modernizing the country. Amir Kabir sought to make the country independent from Europeans using a Western and European model for its development. It may be concluded that the distinctiveness of the Nasiri period during the reign of Nasiruddin Shah from 1848 to 1896 in art and architecture is due to Amir Kabir, who took first steps in the industrialization, westernization, and secularization of the structure of Persian society at the beginning of the second half of the 19th century. Abbas Mirza, the Qajar prince, had a similar role in the pre-Nasiri period at the beginning of the first half of the 19th century. It seems reasonable to categorize the first decades of the 19th century as a period of Safavid revivalism, not only because of clear clear similarities between Qajar and Safavid buildings, but also in a more general aspect of art. The system of apprenticeship in both the Safavid and the early Qajar periods provided a required number of professional decorative artists, artisans, and traditional builders, especially for royal and official buildings. Traditional plasterers, architects, stonemasons, tilers, and bricklayers were the main factors by which the continuity of Iranian architecture during centuries was achieved. For the first time in 1862, academic discipline of painting in the Darul Furun replaced the traditional system of apprenticeship in which many Iranian artists had taught over the centuries. The royal workshop system, which had been remained unrivaled, at least since the Safavid period, was integrated with Darul Funun. Mirza Reza and Mirza Jafar were the first Iranian modern engineers who studied in the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich in London from 1815 to 1819. They were two of the 5 students who had been sent out by Qajar Prince Abbas Mirza to Britain for strengthening and modernizing the national military. Even though neither of them had studied architecture, they were involved in designing or leading a construction project for the government because of their acquired technical knowledge in Britain about constructing fortifications. Muhammad Taqi Khan Memarbashi was the chief traditional builder of the college, and Shahzadeh Bahman Mirza was probably the supervisor from the royal court. The first design for the building of Darul Funun was by Mirza Reza, which was inspired by the design of the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich in Britain, the academy in which they had studied. All the educational rooms were arranged around a central courtyard, and this was also a common way of organizing a space in Iranian-Islamic design. As you see, it was not a new idea in Iranian architecture, but the main European influence was in the means of access to the rooms from the corridor behind, whereas Iranian-Islamic architecture access was usually directly from the central courtyard. This may be the first direct influence of Western educational spaces on Iranian-built school. An old aerial view of the Darul Funun during the Nasiri period, over there, before it was reconstructed, shows Qajar architectural characters in the gables, arches, and openings. Nikolai Markov, a Russian architect, was the only architecture teacher of the Darul Funun College in the first intake of Iranian architecture students in 1927, according to an announcement in the Talat newspaper. He changed all of these characteristics from Qajar to his unique architectural style during the renovation in 1929. In this modification, he had no opportunity to blend a European plan with an Islamic elevation, as in his other works. But the combination of different Irano-Islamic architectural elements ranging from the pre-Islamic to the Safavid period in characteristic of his eclectic style can be seen. Not only have Westernism, nationalism, and modernism influenced the cultural and architectural taste of the Iranian society, but they also had an impact on that of the authorities and consequently on that of the university architects, who were commissioned by the westernizing governments of the Qajars and the Pahlavis. The first Iranian university, before that, it is what happened in Iranian architecture. We have pre-Islamic Persian architecture before Islam, Islamic architecture, and Western architecture, which was influenced by Bauhaus and other movements, architectural movements. And the last 200 years is kind of interaction between these three. It is a timeline showing the Pahlavi period and Islamic revolutionary period, and the time French architects came to Iran. The University of Tehran, which was designed by a number of European architects, was architecturally a noticeable mix of the Bauhaus and the Beaux-Arts in style. Function was the main concern of a modern university architect, and functionalism, minimalism, and westernization were the dominant approaches upon which architects' designs were based. In the second half of the 20th century, the enthusiasm toward international styles gradually gave the way to regionalism. University of Tehran and the similarity to the exposition in the Grand Exposition in Paris in the late 19th century, European Plan Faculty, University of Shiraz, it is a new modern architecture in Iran, and localizing modern and vernacular architecture in universities came after the revolution, Islamic Revolution in 1979. And you see the same building changed on the other side to this. It's localized. And this study will contribute to the literature about possible localized approaches in designing this specific building type, and these approaches are likely to be applicable to similar conditions in other developing countries in which tradition and modernity are challenging to appropriate modern universal principles, material, and technology to local conditions as the result of this cultural hybridity. Thank you for your time.
Well done to both of you. I think both of those have just covered huge topics in 10 minutes. Now, both come from architecture backgrounds, but you could almost not have two different presentations, really. What I think is really fascinating, Paramaz, about your presentation is that understanding of the melting pot that architecture can be, where you go away, you bring back aspects, and then you combine it with the local. In education policy, in curriculum, that same thing is going on all the time. And it's sometimes interesting to just sit back and think, well, why are things like they are? And you can start tracking. Certainly in Australia, we follow in the footsteps of the UK a lot around policy. But you know, where has the classroom itself come from? It's so endemic, and I think it's been just great seeing those little bits of stories about, you know, your Grand Minister who'd been away, he'd learned a few things, came back, completely transformed the country. And goodness me, your politicians stay around for a long time. 50 years or so, wasn't it? No, so I thought that was a really interesting insight to how the westernisation, modernisation, but also nationalism. The place where I thought the two might have merged, and they didn't, and I'm going to sort of challenge you on this, is that traditional Iranian architecture does some incredible things in terms of working with the environment, you know, particularly harsh environments. And we're not necessarily seeing that in these buildings, but maybe we should see more of those kind of that knowledge that's been developed across hundreds, centuries of years about how to work using passive techniques.
Yeah, and the problem with some modern buildings built in the 1950s, 1970s is this climate issue, because they're just built by Israeli and American United States architects from the United States, and they didn't design specifically for this site, and they just copied the plan from other countries. Modern buildings just built, and they are not culturally from climatal. They are not suitable for climate of the desert.
The other side of that coin is that you did suggest that what was seen overseas, the courtyard model, was something that people were familiar with, and so sometimes when you go away, you see the familiar and bring it back. So it's a really fascinating topic. I'm going to ask Pippa a really sort of straightforward question that you won't be able to answer. How many items of data did you collect over your PhD? You're at the end.
Clear of 1 million.
How many?
Over 1 million.
So Pippa was measuring school environments, prefab school environments in a whole range of climate zones, in a whole range of states around Australia. Sometimes you'd be travelling for about 3 days to get to a school environment. The measuring was inserted onto the wall and it would be sending data over the Wi-Fi every 15 minutes.
So it sent 96 measurements a day over an entire year for 8 classrooms. And that was just to measure 4 parameters. That was just to measure 4 of the parameters, and I measured 16. So then add a whole other layer of data. So I was collecting data continuously, which meant it happened all the time, periodically, which was seasonal, and then once off. Because there are some things you can measure in a classroom that you only need data about once, such as reverberation, unless they go ahead and do some kind of refurbishment. So much data.
And probably both investigations are really, in the end, qualitative. Even the work that you've been doing, which is very quantitative, in the end you've done this qualitative overlay because you've been wanting to understand what impact it has on the students. And I think the issue of air quality, you know, this space, we're probably all feeling a bit tired, but you can really tell if the acoustics are bad, but not so much the air quality. And I think those kinds of lessons and your focus on communication, it's just exemplary, I think. Pippa, you know, I know there was a moment there where she gathered all this data and then she thought, OMG, WTF, I'm going to do with this data.
Yeah, it's terrible.
But you kind of worked it all out and you come up with this quite neat, I actually wished, Ken, I think we needed you there saying, let's make them bigger. Some of these beautiful presentations, but sometimes you wanted to actually see into the graphic a little bit more and to understand what in fact they all are. But what a great sort of tool, and we tested this tool, haven't we, with Pippa on a couple of schools. Yeah, and it's useful. It's useful, isn't it? Because it gives you a focus.
You're both asking actually, Carol, what you did with the information.
We tweaked the environment, the journal.
So that's another aspect of it. What do people actually do once the evaluation's taken place? How they respond?
And I think that's something I'm very interested in developing, because what I found through doing the analysis of all the data is that just even making really small improvement or small changes can improve the indoor environment quality. And that's why I try to put the emphasis on it being cost effective. So rather than going in and being like, oh God, the indoor environment quality is awful, we're going to have to spend $200,000 redoing this space. It's like, well, hold on, let's think about why. And I hope, I'm not sure, when I first came into this space, I have this ridiculous level of awareness now that's almost a negative thing. But I came in and I sat down this morning, I looked at the screen, I was like, oh, I wish they'd closed that blind. And then as I was closing the blind, it's like, and I'm like, oh, I can hear that noise. And then I'm like, oh, I wonder if you can somehow like zone the lights in this space, because there's just a bit too much light on the front of it. And like, this is what my brain does constantly. And now I've got this this data set for these 10 classrooms. And even if they just did simple things like the curtains are actually on this tracking device, which means that they might be able to open the windows, but they can actually only ever open it up 1/3, because each bulky window, the bulky curtain either side kind of pushes 1/3 of the light out. And yeah, the building meets the BCA requirements for 10% of the floor area and windows, but the curtains don't. So it's like small things, like it actually wouldn't be a huge ask to change the fittings of
and on your travels, you found that in a lot of classrooms, the windows were covered with, you know, pictures.
Yeah, and I think windows were locked.
We noticed when we went to school then that the students were saying, you know, this sound really is terrible. The teachers don't hear it at all. And so that you know, age difference is something that adults need to understand. Enough! So, both of you, I think, the sort of the space where you're at in terms of the qualitative research and the rich information that we've got is really interesting to see, and it's nice to hear two architects presenting in such different fields. I haven't spoken anyone else. Questions. Oh yeah, there you go. I've had 8. You can do 2.
Pippa, are you able to translate this into preemptive work for architects so that they can then, instead of us getting in and doing the post-building assessment and finding mistakes, actually look at a set of plans before we build and say, well, actually, you've missed X, Y, and Z?
I think there's two levels. So the first is it could be on some level used as a checklist. So as you're designing a space, you're really thinking about what the criteria are and what kind of design solutions you're making to try and address them. I think there are various modelling tools as well, and that's where Claire's emphasised how I've tried to put a kind of a qualitative spin on quantitative data, and that's because a lot of the green building rating tools have done exactly that. They've tried to translate what are very quantitative numbers into some understanding of, you know, like 5-star, woohoo, 4-star, yeah, okay, or platinum, yeah, like there's a level that people understand. So I guess by way of analysing plans, I'm still yet to understand. Without some modelling capacity, probably plans alone aren't enough. But certainly in terms of thinking about it as a checklist and thinking, particularly if you were to carry on maybe some of the key findings, because that's effectively what I've done is I've taken all the case studies that I developed or used this tool to develop, and I've put together a kind of these are the key problems that we just keep coming up against, and that might be used as a checklist in combination. So a bit of a mixed answer.
Just getting my hand up before Wes goes.
Yeah.
Faramaz, I just wondered if you come across the concept of critical regionalism.
Yep.
Whether you're going to use that as a part of a theoretical background to your analysis of what's going on in educational buildings.
Yeah, it is useful. The thing I have noticed during this research was that I found that at first it was Europeanizing Iranian architecture, but as you see, it ended with Iranianizing European and modern architecture, and we have different and opposite approaches to one stylistic subject of architecture. And yeah, critical regionalism, one of the theories that the things I've worked on my confirmation report, and my supervisor and panel member told me to develop that in my confirmation report. Yeah.
I also wanted to sort of pick you up on something where you spoke about, you listed the designers, you know, the engineers, the architects, interior designers, the landscape architects. Let's not forget educators are really important designers of learning spaces, not only because they're sort of involved in terms of the educational brief, but also once you occupy a space, you know, it's like the difference between a house and a home. The educators, the design sensibilities that educators bring to spaces shouldn't be perhaps underestimated. I'm sure you don't.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, for leading that. Thank you, Faramaz.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pippa. I'd try to update you. We'll talk a lot about both those topics. Time goes on. Two quick reminders before we grab a coffee. First reminder is that the talks that you're hearing will get captured in individual videos. Celia's doing that work at the moment, and she'll edit it down for us. We'll put it on the website, so each of these individual talks will be there. Married to those will be the PowerPoint slides if presenters are happy for us to use them, and if they make sure Celia has a copy of them. So that's the reminder to presenters that PowerPoint slides go to Celia, because it would be good if people show you a video and see the slides at the same time. Obviously, it's more informative. Second reminder is that at the back we do have the mock-ups of the book that is going to be a result of the papers from today. And I'm very keen that people have a look at the two covers, one on the left, one on the right, the blue one and the red one. Everyone will tell Ben that the blue one is the best one. So you can do that for us sometime during the afternoon.
My last email was titled "Democracy Sucks."
We have 15 minutes. Please grab a coffee, and we'll have Tom and have a short talk to us when we get back here at 3 o'clock. Thank you.